Dad, we should increase production to meet export demands.
Let's review our logistic insurance needs.
We'll need more workers.
Okay, make sure they are fully covered.
Also, it's time to launch into e-commerce.
Great move, son. Let's prioritize cybersecurity.
Are you ready to grow your business? Talk to us at Chubb Insurance about protection crafted for your business needs. Not just insured, Chubb insured. Visit chubb.com/my.
This is a download from BFM 89.9, the business station.
This is Tech Talk, made possible by TM1.
It's Fun Friday. My name is Jeff Sandhu, together with Culture Pop's Matt Armitage. Bespoke currencies, housing developments, shared ownership, brain implants. It seems like the big tech has concrete plans for our future. On today's show, we try to combine the worlds of hard news and science fiction to figure out if the future will be a world of benign tech assistance or a surveillance capitalism nightmare. Matt, I know the brain implant thing has got you thinking.
Yeah, and I'm sorry I made you say surveillance capitalism nightmare. Everything I do at the moment comes out surveillance capitalism nightmare. The brain implant thing. Now, I kind of went into this area, not entirely intentionally, on last week's A Bit of Culture, which, of course, is still in the BFM archive. You can listen to that. And we covered the story a little bit as well on last week's Geek Squawk.
You mean Neuralink?
Yeah. I'm not going to repeat that episode again. The podcast is there, so go and listen to it. Jeff gives a really good explanation of how neural implant tech works and the different companies that are currently working in this space. And actually, we're going to be talking about it again in this week's Geek Squawk. So one area we didn't have time to get into so much was the likelihood of this kind of technology actually becoming commonplace.
Because most of the coverage was concentrated on the tech itself.
Well, this comes back to the way that technology is often covered in the media, this breathless rush to herald the latest development. And I think the specialist tech press has become a lot more grown up in the way it covers technology over the last few years.
In what sense?
Well, when you go to sites like The Verge or Wired or Engadget, Motherboard, the tech sections of the big news sites, even the way we cover tech here on BFM as well, if you went back 10 or 15 years, you'd mostly see gadget reviews, how-to guides, life hacks, and maybe the occasional piece about text thumb and this kind of thing to spice things up. Now, when you go to those same sites, you'll find that there's a lot more critical coverage of technology. And by that, I don't mean critical as in negative. I mean that the pieces don't read like gushing press releases anymore. The writers aren't falling for the spin. And something this show, I think, would be very different without. You see a lot more investigative reporting coming from the tech sector.
And it wasn't there before?
Well, I think it was there with a lot of the specialist sites because they always had that kind of bigger picture, broader focus look. And partly it's because tech is a lot more mainstream now. It's not this, little side thing that sits on the side of the website. So you have much more of an editorial spotlight on the sector, and that means people who also cover political lobbying, the environment, financial news, and of course, there are those big, juicy investigative stories there as well.
And we are referencing content like the Facebook and Cambridge Analytica documentary, The Great Hack.
Yeah, in a way, but, on a much larger scale. I mean, in recent years, we've also had companies like Theranos rise and fall, so there's been a lot of coverage of that company. But if we go back to Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, one of the journalists whose work was, super critical in exposing that data scandal was a British Observer and Guardian reporter called Carol Cadwallader. Now, if you read some of the pieces about her or see the amazing TED talk she gave earlier this year, one of the most incredible things she says is that she had to teach herself to become an investigative journalist. She knew there was a story there, but she had to teach herself a new skill set to actually bring it out and bring it to public attention because she needed to have that forensic attention to detail. She had to learn all of that, the things that investigative journalists typically need.
And how does that connect us to Neuralink?
Because it almost seems like there are two parallel sets of reporting when we come to this kind of brain-related technology. In the more lifestyle press, you're seeing all of these, again, the hyperbole, the gushing. It's all, oh, isn't it amazing that we're able to do this? Or isn't it really scary that we're able to do this? It doesn't touch so much on the implications, whereas the tech and the scientific press, which is the stuff that we've kind of covered more, is a lot more measured, because for people in this area, this kind of development is something we see as being inevitable. A lot of people are working on it. It's literally waiting for the first company to be the first past the post. So that coverage tends to be a lot more implication focused.
And that brings us back to the likelihood of it happening.
Well, exactly. I think Elon Musk mentioned in the various reports that he wanted the procedure to implant the devices to be as safe and ubiquitous as LASIK surgery for your eyes. But there are plenty of pieces in the scientific press that speak to doctors and scientists in the neural field who have a much more cautious opinion, even if they are broadly champions of this kind of technology. And they point out that however you present this, it is still an operation, a medical procedure.
And all surgical procedures carry risk.
Well, precisely. And though the percentage of people who have had complications with something like LASIK, for example, is really tiny, the effects can still be life-changing, permanently blurred or restricted vision or damage to the retina. You might not be able to continue in your job, for example. You might not be able to live in the same place. You might not be able to drive a car. You'll experience the thousands of tiny and major changes that come about as the result of any life-changing accident. And that's just when we're talking about your eyes. We're talking about brain surgery here. We're talking about implanting things in your brain. So even if the procedure itself is minor, the implications, again, I'm going to keep saying that word over and over today, the implications are enormous because we're not robots or computers. If you damage our brain, our CPU, you can't just swap it out for a new one.
So you think we will see these implants more for therapeutic rather than enhancement?
For the time being, I think so. Musk puts forward the case of combining healthy brains with the power of AI and essentially boosting people's intelligence. But with the technology at its current levels, it doesn't seem that the risk-reward is kind of balanced in its favor yet.
And I guess your next point is, why would anyone let Elon Musk put a chip in your head?
Well, there's certainly been a lot of that kind of comment in the wake of the story, and it references back to Tesla's reputation at production and build quality, but that's not actually the area I want to go. In fact, in terms of tech evangelists wanting to put a chip in my brain, I think Elon would be one of the more benign. I would probably have more trust in him than I would in a lot of other companies. I would certainly have more concern about Facebook or Google or Amazon or even Apple wanting to do the same thing. In fact, one of the issues that Musk raised was using this kind of blended technology, humans and artificial intelligence, as a way to mitigate the risks of AI by introducing a human element into what the machines do. I mean, I'll be honest, I don't really follow his logic there at all, but then I don't really see AI as the same kind of threat that he seems to.
So your problem is with the chip rather than the chipper?
Yes, Governor. No, it comes back to something we've covered on the show probably way too many times, which is who actually owns the technology. And that's pretty much the root of the topic for today. One of the things that we've thought experimented here is what happens if you have a sentient artificial intelligence sitting in your head. Are you one individual? Are you two individuals? What if the AI is part of a larger neural network? So you're effectively borrowing just one part of it. It's a really complex issue.
And I imagine you have a complicated set of questions to answer.
Yeah, which is why we talk about the need for machine rights on the show. At least if that AI is regarded as an individual, then you have to make that distinction between two legally declared people who might simply be sharing the same head.
Whereas a non-sentient AI is likely to be owned by a third party.
Yeah, and that's why I find Elon Musk's scenario actually more unsettling, because the chances are that that AI chip would be owned by that third-party company, probably not even by Neuralink, I can foresee them becoming more of a hardware provider that taps you into the software environments of Google or Amazon or Facebook, or if you've got a really short attention span, Twitter. So, who owns what? What implications, it's that word again, does that have for ownership of your thoughts and your memories? And I'll be honest, I'm much more scared about that part of the process than the implantation of the chip itself, because that's actually where the greater risk lies, in your memories and in your data.
Because someone might hack your brain.
Well, for most of us, buy us a couple of beers and you can hack most of the stuff out of our brain that you'd want over the course of a couple of hours. I'm actually more worried about weakness and greed, the weakness that might allow a personality test to scrape data out of your mind, or the greed of a company that wants to commercialize your thoughts and memories, or even potentially to plant information into your head directly.
Isn't that a kind of stretch even for you?
Well, okay, this show is going out just after 11 a.m. if you're listening live. You've just had your breakfast. It's Friday. You're looking forward to a long lunch and trying to get out of the office as early as possible. So how many of you have started thinking about food just because I've reminded you that it's nearly lunchtime and that the weekend's coming up? These prompts don't have to be overt. These nudges can be very, very simple. They can be very subtle, but that doesn't mean that they're not effective.
And aren't people mature and sophisticated enough to be able to separate out?
But yes, they are. But look at the medium. This is radio or podcast, depending on how you're listening. I haven't made you hungry. I've just made you aware that you are hungry. Now, a certain person who is very close to me and has made her living in worlds connected to marketing and advertising has been watching reruns of The Big Bang Theory, where one of the lead characters, Penny, works at a restaurant chain called Cheesecake Factory. And that same person has been bugging me for days to get her cheesecake, even though she knows full well that the desire from it is actually coming from that show. But knowing the source doesn't eliminate the desire. If anything, it actually makes it more annoying.
When we talk about a neural chip, how does that affect the medium?
Well, when I watch something on TV or I'm listening to it or, someone's listening to this show, you're aware that the nudge is coming from that external source. So what happens when you turn that around, when that nudge comes from inside your own head? I'm not talking about an advert playing or a banner ad floating in front of my eyes, for example. What if my stomach sends that hunger signal to my brain, the chip reads it and heads to an ad server where it suggests that what I really want to eat is a dodo burger at Culture Labs, my future cell-cultured fast food chain? How does my brain know where that desire for the dodo burger came from? And that's just for lunch. Imagine the potential for, say, deciding that you dislike someone based on a database of so-called undesirable people, or that somebody has decided that a particular person or politician is untrustworthy. We're a long way from having the framework of laws, regulations, ethics and codes of behavior that will make this kind of technology safe for anyone that doesn't have an absolute therapeutic need for it.
I don't know about you, but I'm craving for some dodo burger at Culture Labs.
Apparently dodo tasted awful, but that didn't stop them wiping out the entire species.
After the break, could today's tech companies be the nation states of tomorrow? We'll be right back. BFM 89.9.
You're listening to Tech Talk, made possible by TM1.
Blues, folk, metal. BFM 89.9.
You're listening to Tech Talk, made possible by TM1.
And we're back. It's MSP together with Culture Pop's Matt Armitage, and today we're talking about tech rot, or the tech rulers of tomorrow. And I have to say, Matt, I think you're going to have to work harder on the meme generation stuff.
I know it's not my strongest area, but I think the idea of tech rot could set in. Did you see what I did there?
You let the rot set in.
Exactly. Positive reinforcement. Maybe I'm better at this mind-shaping stuff than people think.
Which is why we're all glad you don't run a tech company.
You're probably right, though it would be kind of nice to be a billionaire. I'd rather be worrying about which port to get my yacht refitted in rather than whether I can get an appointment to get the car serviced. I'm probably also not helping my chances of working for big tech with these shows either. But before the break, yeah, as you were saying, we were talking about brain chips. And that's the thing with all this technology. It's the convergence that actually takes us by surprise. And that goes back to what I was saying about tech media earlier. We're seeing more coverage rather that joins the threads together, that looks at what happens if this technology and that technology come together and work together. So it becomes about control of these different facets of your life.
Like information.
Yeah, I mean, we still have access to a lot of information sources, but a lot of us are surrendering those choices to the algorithms of companies like Facebook, Google, YouTube, all the usual suspects. I'd imagine quite a few of our listeners are regular listeners of the Reply All podcast, and hello, Najman, that means you. On a recent episode of that show entitled Louder, their team talks about the ways that algorithms on social sharing services tend to amplify extremist content. And they make the point that on YouTube, the recommendation engine, that box that prompts you what to watch next, that recommendation engine is not a feature of YouTube. It is the actual product. It's the mechanism that hooks us and keeps us watching. It's the mechanism that drives both the data and the revenue. And that's hard for a lot of people to get their heads around because the product isn't the service itself. It isn't the videos. It's the algorithm that selects the content for us to watch.
So the tech companies have the news sewn up.
Well, as I said, you're perfectly free to opt into other ways to get your news. But the thing is, a lot of us don't bother. And I think that's happening on a scale that has even taken some of the tech titans by surprise. I think Mark Zuckerberg was genuinely shocked by how his platform was used to shift public and political opinion in various elections. And that's understandable. This is new technology. It's a media framework. And the people designing those platforms aren't always aware of the power they have, the role they play, or the influence that they wield. Or at least they don't understand it initially. The real point is what you do with that information after you've come to the realization.
Launch your own currency?
Well, yeah, not my first choice, but hey, this is where the science fiction part of today's show comes in. So I do want to make it clear for legal reasons that I'm not alleging that any particular tech company is planning to do this. This is merely hypothetical. And its similarity to real-world events is no more than a coincidence. So I was reading a review of a new novel called Zed by Joanna Kavanagh, and though I haven't read the book yet.
No audiobook?
Not yet, which is why I haven't read it. Although the text-to-speech on my Kindle is getting better, so I might try that. Which is ironic. I'm relying on a tech megacorp to read a book about a tech megacorp called Beetle that has its own currency and is effectively ungoverned. And that review kind of kicked me off along the path of today's show. Alongside older works like The Circle by Dave Eggers, some of you might have read or seen the movie, which has more of a surveillance capitalism focus. But the currency part is especially interesting.
Like the Karl Marx quote, society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange is like the sorcerer.
Very nicely chosen. We often say that this kind of cloud and digital technology is a bit like magic. And that's exactly what sorcery is, although when we say sorcery, it often has more of a negative kind of perspective. But one step to successful surveillance capitalism is certainly to control the money supply. It's kind of like the ultimate Bond villain fantasy. I definitely want to have my own culture pop currency, which I would call the occult, of course. And the O rather would be a zero because it would have no value other than to make me rich. But the idea of having your own money supply is actually being mirrored in the real world. Mark Zuckerberg is betting that Facebook's newly announced cryptocurrency Libra will be the preferred medium of exchange in the future.
And you think Facebook wants it as a means of control?
Not necessarily. I mean, on a purely pragmatic level, there are huge swaths of the world where people are more likely to have a WhatsApp account than they are to have a bank account. So blockchain is a great way to extend financial services to those in casual occupations or in countries where regular banking is, for the middle classes, or it's too unequally distributed to be useful to most people. So that puts Facebook firmly in the center of this new economic model. And as we've mentioned before, e-wallets are really eating into Facebook's territory. They're adding social media type services to their offerings, and their transactions are something we make all the time. We make financial transactions all the time. So there's that hard incentive to use those e-wallet apps, whereas Facebook only has these soft incentives. It has to keep coming up with new entitlements, new hooks to keep us engaged and to keep us posting.
But a currency is a major step beyond an e-wallet.
Well, that kind of depends on your vantage point. If you're a fintech startup, you grab the portion of the money supply that you have access to. So you'll probably start in one country. You'll expand your network of services and retail points as you scale. But what if a quarter of the world's population is already your customer? You have virtually unlimited resources, and walled garden ecosystems are actually your company's speciality. If you look at it through that light, then a currency actually seems to make sense. And given the sophistication of blockchain technology, it might actually look surprisingly doable to you.
And what would your concern be? Market power?
Well, this is where I want to extend the analogy and where I'm borrowing from sci-fi. So again, I want to make it clear that there is nothing to imagine or suggest that this is a path that Facebook is intending to walk down. And as I said, I've adapted some of this from what I read about Joanna Kavanagh's said. So imagine that a company controls the currency that most of the world is using. That would, of course, give that company enormous power.
Access?
Yeah, access would be critical. If you were frozen out of that company's framework for transgressive posts, unwanted political views, that company could effectively freeze you out of society. You wouldn't be able to use their currency or financial transfer systems. You wouldn't be able to get paid, or if you ran a company, your company might fail. So you could potentially lose your job. All it would take is a message to your employer from the company overseeing that currency that you were no longer eligible to use the network. They could no longer pay you, and they would be forced to terminate your services. So it becomes a very quick and effective means of control.
And presumably that also applies to society at large.
Well, yeah, because you can't pay for things. How do you get healthcare or insurance or pay your rent? How do you get access to education and higher education? You could be frozen out. Effectively, you've been declared a non-person by a company. And where will your right of appeal or your legal status be? And for governments, I think it would be just as much of a nightmare. The company would probably register itself in a no-tax or very low-tax location. No central government would have the power of oversight over the transactions because the currency would be something that the company controls itself. So the company's income would effectively be invisible and completely internalized. No market oversight, no public scrutiny. So the kind of data scandals we've seen over the past few years simply would never come to light because there would be no publicly available paper trail. The company has effectively declared itself to be a virtual sovereign state.
Can we really get to this place from neural chips and money?
Well, I've pretty much run us out of time, so I'll have to summarize a lot of the other developments. We're seeing Google move into property development and transport. We mentioned a big quayside development in Canada by one of Alphabet's offshoots recently. We know that Amazon is moving into healthcare, not to mention dominating pretty much anything that has any retail connection. So if we go back to that Dave Eggers novel, The Circle, it's easy to imagine every part of your life, housing, transport, work, entertainment, education, health, retail, controlled by a massive corporation or corporations who may or may not have any great regard for the laws of the countries in which they operate. Companies that can simply afford to pay whatever fines regulators throw at them and keep barreling towards their preferred endpoint.
Is there any reason to suggest that your tech rot won't happen, that these people are not our future rulers?
Well, for one thing, there's nothing to suggest that there's any consensus amongst the leaders and owners of these firms, which is a good thing for us. As their business models expand and become more octopus-like, they're increasingly becoming each other's competitors in multiple markets. And that's without mentioning any of the equally huge and powerful potential competitors that are still mostly sitting behind China's Great Firewall. So they have to beat each other out before they can really start to cement any plans for greater world domination. And that's, of course, assuming that they have any of those plans.
So your silver lining is us, as usual.
Well, yeah, and don't take my word for it. Go out and look into this stuff for yourself. As I said, the tech and science media are rising to these challenges to give balanced and nuanced coverage. There's lots of other tech coverage on BFM that Jeff is behind and has absolutely nothing to do with me whatsoever. So listen to some of that. Read and watch some of the sci-fi content coming out and imagine how today's technology could be used in those settings. But don't rely on those 30-second primers or those 7 reasons to type posts that get shared, promoted and fed to you on the same media platforms that we're talking about as being part of the problem, creating these dangers. So bypass those companies' reinforcement mechanisms and engines. Stop listening when they tell you how hungry you are and what you're hungry for. And you can still kind of consume all of that stuff for entertainment, but try and look a little bit deeper. Ignore anything that has an exclamation mark or all capitals in the headline. Make up your own mind and don't listen to anyone who wants to tell you about lizards, unless it's David Attenborough and he really is telling you about lizards.
And hopefully with that, though, we can stop the tech rot. I'm not sure about the term tech rot, but I guess, that will catch on.
Keep saying it.
We'll be right back with more BFM 89.9.
Tech Talk, made possible by TM1. To learn more, visit tm1.com.my.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. To find more great interviews, go to bfm.my or find us on iTunes. BFM 89.9, the business station.